Hi, I'm John Stossel. On this new DVD, we've added new segments designed especially for the classroom. We hope you like them. Also, on our website, stosselintheclassroom.org, we posted other segments, both from me and from other people we think you may find interesting. We post them along with suggestions as to how you might use these videos in your classroom. While you're on the website, please click the Give Us Feedback page and give us feedback. From your comments, we learn ways to make these videos better for your students and you, and find out what helps best spark discussion in the classroom. Thanks. Hope you like the new DVD. Private's better? That doesn't sound right to people. Private seems selfish, secretive. By contrast, public or government-run sounds like sharing. We're all in this together.
Sharing is caring.
It's like that children's song. People think sharing means public, and people like sharing. It's one reason governments grow. But as government takes control of more of life, the private sector is less able to bring us all the wonderful things it has brought us so far. I have this cell phone because it was invented without government first having to give the developers permission. Government was barely even aware that people were working on these things. Permissionless innovation is a wonderful thing, says the author of this book. He's Adam Thierer of the Mercatus Institute. And this permissionless innovation that brought us Google, Facebook, the phone, is threatened now?
Yeah, it is, John. There's a lot of efforts to impose permission-based systems on these new technologies. We're seeing it a lot with Uber and the sharing economies, but we're seeing it also in other fields like drones, like driverless cars, where it could make a real difference.
Drones, they're inventing all kinds of things, but the government says you can't do it unless you get an FAA license.
That's right. The basic argument that they make is that, there's these hypothetical worst cases that could occur, and they end up basing public policy upon those hypothetical worst case scenarios. The problem with that is if you base all public policy on hypothetical worst case scenarios, then best case scenarios will never come about. We'll never get life-saving or life-enriching innovations.
And the drone could crash a plane, but they weigh much less than seagulls, which planes hit all the time.
It's certainly true that there will always be accidents. There are always risks in the world. But we have ways of solving that without preemptive, precautionary, permission-based controls for everything. We can have common law solutions. We can have lawsuits. We can have contracts and property laws. Things like this can solve problems after the fact without the heavy hand of government quashing all that wonderful innovation.
Banning it first.
Right, exactly.
So drone makers are now going overseas.
Yeah, a lot of them are. A lot of them are basing their testing in Canada and Australia. A lot of driverless car companies are going to the UK.
If these rules had been in effect before, we might not have Google and Facebook and smartphones?
Exactly. Think about it. Think about 20 years ago if Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, if Steve Jobs of Apple, or anybody from Google had to come to the government, say the Federal Communications Commission, and get their blessing or a license to operate. You have to wonder how many of them would even exist today.
And I try to think about how come all these things were invented in the United States rather than Europe.
Right.
We have more people, plenty of smart people.
America got it right with our public policy towards the internet and digital technology.
The first time.
The first time around. 20 years ago, Congress and the Clinton administration put in place a set of policies that were basically permissionless innovation based. They basically gave innovators and entrepreneurs a green light, said, go ahead, do this, we won't come down heavy on you. But that, of course, as you've noted, John, is already changing. And the problem is that we have forgotten the lessons of the past where America really went out and conquered the world. And our companies are household names and envy of everyone across the globe.
What's been invented in Europe?
I have a hard time even naming a major European-based information technology innovator. Whenever I ask a crowd this question, I get blank stares.
At the beginning of the computer revolution, France said, we're going to control this. And they created a computer company, Minitel.
Right.
They gave people computers. Here, throw out your yellow pages, use these.
Yeah.
They had them in 5 different colors. They were going to be the leader, according to the media I read.
Right. Basically, France took an industrial policy approach to the internet. They basically wanted to micromanage or plan it from above. But that's not the way innovation happens. It's a more bottom-up or spontaneous kind of thing. You have to create the right environment and let innovators innovate.
And now Europe, threatening Google, has this thing called right to be forgotten.
Yeah, it's crazy. This is basically censorship on a global scale for not just the internet, but for, in a sense, history and journalism. They're going to scrub history away with this so-called right to be forgotten.
The argument is there are some mistakes out there, and my reputation, my future could be smeared. Somebody Googles me and some bad thing is written that really isn't exactly true. Let me start with a clean slate. And the courts in Europe said, right, you deserve that.
Sure, everybody makes mistakes, but the reality is that if we have a global internet censorship regime based on the idea of cleaning up everybody's past mistakes, that's going to be a disaster. The whole global internet's going to look like China or Soviet Russia runs it.
There may be crooks you can't find out about.
That's right. I mean, basically, there's always going to be another way to find information, but Europe wants to impose their censorship regime on the rest of the world. You think about all the amazing medical innovations that are already out there, but we could have many, many more if we allow the ramifications of the internet and the digital revolution to come into the world of health and medicine. But our FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, very heavy-handed, very precautionary, doesn't want to allow for that sort of things, and they're driving a lot of innovators offshore. We have 3D printers today that can actually manufacture on the spot all sorts of amazing things, including, as I saw this one day at Johns Hopkins University Hospital at a conference, prosthetic hands for children with limb deficiencies. Volunteers were making on the spot these prosthetic hands for kids. But technically, what they're doing is illegal. The FDA says you need to have rules and licenses for these sort of things, even though it's all being done free, for very cheap, for parents who need these things for kids that usually cost thousands of dollars. Why would we stop that innovation?
They probably got away with it because they were volunteering their time and their effort. It was done for free if they'd tried to make a buck.
That's exactly right. Basically, everything changes when you charge even a penny for something. Whether it's drones or 3D printers or virtual reality, you do it in a voluntary sense or a sharing sense, it's all fine. But as soon as you want to charge a penny, you're going to be regulated.
Thank you, Adam Thier.
2, 1, 0.
That's a satellite being launched into space by a private company, SpaceX. The private company found better and cheaper ways to shoot things into space. For example, when government, NASA, sent their rockets up, the rockets would eventually burn and fall apart, so they'd just tax you and build new ones for every mission. The private company found a way to bring that same rocket safely back to Earth. That's what they're applauding there. The private company did what government couldn't do and did it with much less money. That happens all the time, although most bureaucrats at NASA wouldn't want to hear that. Lori Garver is an exception. She worked at NASA 9 years. President Obama appointed her to the second highest position there. But the #1 guy doesn't agree with you. You think privatization's a good thing.
Sure, of course. I mean, this country was built on it, and the space program is a high technology, leading edge program, and it should be advancing our capabilities so the private sector can take over. I think a lot of
you say, of course, I say, of course. Why don't they get it?
It's a government bureaucracy. You know this. And they just are, their incentives are not to do things more efficiently. If we threw away our airplanes or our ships after each time we flew them, they would be so expensive. But if you're all about the jobs, you just like building new ones.
You're a Democrat. You were an advisor to Hillary's presidential campaign. The Democrats don't want to privatize.
Yes. In fact, President Obama proposed privatizing much of this, and the bipartisan congressional response was extremely negative. When President Obama came in and I was the head of his transition team, our focus was on driving technology. We weren't going to build a rocket to compete with SpaceX. We were going to seed those private companies and let them flourish. And we got shut down in the Hill the first year. They demanded we build this big rocket that's going to cost $50 billion and maybe
Congress wanted to send money to their district.
Correct. If you're competing, you can't say who's going to win and what district it's going to be in. So it's a lot harder to do that if you're using the public's money. The great thing now is Elon's using mostly his own money. So is Jeff Bezos with Blue Origins.
So what Congress was doing is disgusting. Do people call them on it?
No, I think our space program really gets a pass. Everybody loves the space program, and NASA has this wonderful history, and people just assume it's going to be on the cutting edge and doing the right thing. They don't know that our journey to Mars is built on 1970s technology and reusing engines and testing them on test stands that cost $300 million to refurbish from the shuttle days. When I went to Jeff Bezos' facility, Blue Origins, they were building the same quality test stand from the ground up for $30 million. We went to the moon because President Kennedy said, we're going to the moon.
Let's show that. NASA did once do things that had never been done before. After Russia launched a satellite, our president said this.
This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
NASA did that. Government did that. Then what happened?
Absolutely. Well, we are carrying that infrastructure with us today. NASA spends $18 billion of taxpayers' money a year. Half of that goes for that infrastructure that was built for Apollo. They only have about a third of the cost, the buying power, and so they can't really do as much with the rest of it.
So most of the satellites being launched, the rockets going up now, are private companies?
Oh, yes. I mean, most of space has been commercialized.
NASA has a plan to go to Mars.
The journey to Mars. It is building this rocket, probably around $50 billion by the time it's built, with a capsule on top of it, which right now we have no money to do anything beyond that. The soonest we would go to Mars would be the mid-2030s, and those are space shuttle engines that were developed in 1970. I just don't think that that's probably going to be the way we get there. Elon Musk announced he's going to Mars in 2018, not with people, but should he do that anywhere near the range and with his new heavy lift vehicle, it hopefully will start to be obvious we don't need to spend the taxpayers' money on this. We can spend the taxpayers' NASA dollars on going even farther.
And you've been there 9 years. It's not just Congress's fault. NASA itself wants to protect every job.
It's a bureaucracy. People at NASA are wonderful, but the leadership, of course, they're all in tight with aerospace industry. They're going to maybe go work there afterwards. Everybody likes to manage a contract, and so it's a pretty nice system. And at this point, you've got $18 billion of the public's money that I think the space program could do better with.
It could be so much better used, and yet so many Americans say privatization, oh, that's bad. On MSNBC, they do get excited about space travel, but then the host at the time has to say this.
I also worry a great deal about the fact that this is going to private industry, mostly because I keep thinking the competition of private companies in this, on the planet, has not necessarily always led to equitable outcomes.
The outcomes won't be equitable. Private, ick.
Well, I mean, I just can't understand that. Now I work for the airline pilots union, and we all fly in airplanes safely. 700 million people a year. That's a technology that is
private,
completely run by the private sector and goes very well. So this has been an issue. I know people believe that somehow safety is more with the government, but of course we don't have a perfect record at NASA either.
Most Americans assume some things can't be privatized because, well, they're for everyone. Public parks, for example. People say maintaining parks and keeping them accessible to the public is a job for government. The public sector has to do that, and people like that word public. Once I went to a park near here and asked people, which is better, public or private?
Well, obviously public.
If it were private, they'd probably charge you a fee for looking.
Wouldn't you say public? Otherwise we wouldn't be here right now, right?
Actually, they were standing in a privately run park. They just didn't know that. And although people love the idea of public, what comes to your mind if I say the words public toilet?
Oh, well, that's gross. That's gross.
Yes, this is the image I have of public toilets. And my town's public parks, including this one, used to look much like that. Garbage everywhere, buildings covered with graffiti, fields bare of grass.
When parks are well maintained, like that one we were in, it's often because a private group took over. But park users rarely know that.
This is actually a privately managed park.
Really? Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. That's interesting.
And I did notice they have awesome toilets.
Yes, even the toilets are better.
Great toilet because they clean it very nicely.
But what about our national parks? Americans love Yellowstone, Yosemite, Mount Rushmore. Privatize those? Some business might do this. But what's the alternative? Park managers now say, we don't have money for maintenance. In California alone, 150 state parks closed.
They have $1 billion in deferred maintenance, meaning projects that they need, but they don't have money to fund.
It's not just state parks saying, oh, we don't have the money for maintenance. Yosemite streams were filled with raw sewage from a leaky sewer. The Grand Canyon's only source of drinking water is an 83-year-old pipe that breaks as often as 30 times a year. But national parks can't be run by private interests, can they?
Most people probably don't realize it, but many public parks at all levels of government are run successfully by private sector operators.
Often for half the cost.
We run about 150 parks. Our biggest client is the U.S. Forest Service. They're taking something that's a financial loser for them, a real money drain, and by having us run it, they change it from a money drain into a financial benefit because they're actually getting paid rent.
People assume a private company like that guy's will cut corners to make more profit, but the private company has an incentive not to cut corners. It makes more money if it does a good job.
It always seems logical somehow for private management of parks that I'm not going to spend any money to keep the place nice, but my revenues are entirely dependent on people showing up every day.
Right, these private businesses depend on pleasing customers. If they don't please you, the government can fire them. But government never fires itself. That's why private management is almost always better and cheaper.
This is a story of the rich getting richer,
while the poor are now poorer.
Polls show most Americans believe that the poor are getting poorer. I understand why they think that. We hear it all the time.
This rich getting richer thing and the poor getting poor.
The rich get richer, the poor get poorer.
That last man was the head of the NRA. We hear this myth from the left and the right. But what's the truth? What's the big picture? Economics professor Abby Blanco keeps track of the data. What's the truth?
So wages look relatively flat. If you look at the data that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has collected.
And we have a graph of that we can put up.
If you look at the data they've collected since 1964, wages look relatively flat for most Americans.
Not for the rich, not for the top 1%.
Not for the rich, but we're missing the big picture. What are the poorest people in the U.S. able to consume today? So we can look at things like airline travel or cell phones, computers, cars, even things like living space. And what we see is that the poor today spend much less of their income on these kinds of items than they did before, and they're much more accessible to people today, even though they were once exclusively reserved for only the wealthiest Americans.
So why doesn't that show up on these graphs from the government? And you say that it's relatively flat, but to be exact, the poorest people and middle-income people have gained also. The rich got absurdly rich, and the poor did a little better.
It's not true at all. So we can think about the economy or wealth like a pizza. And people typically operate under the assumption that if I get a bigger piece of pizza, you have to get a smaller one. But that's not how wealth works. If the economy is growing and getting larger and larger, even though the piece of wealth that an individual is getting is smaller, it could be bigger overall. So indeed, we see that the poor and Americans in the middle income bracket are also doing much better.
One reason people think the poor are doing worse is that they think it's a zero-sum game. The Hollywood tells them that all the time.
It's a zero-sum game. Somebody wins, somebody loses. Money itself isn't lost or made, it's simply transferred.
That's Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street. But it is made. It's not like Bill Gates took a big piece of the pie so we have less. He baked a million new pies.
Right. So we create new kinds of wealth all the time. It's not just a sunny side of the street for the wealthiest Americans, but it's relatively sunny for the poorest Americans as well.
But Donald Trump says it's a zero-sum game. If we trade, if China wins, we lose.
The trade argument is not just wrong, it's spectacularly wrong. NAFTA's created 34 million jobs in the United States, and an additional 6 million jobs are tied directly to Mexican industry alone.
How? How does it create jobs?
So it creates jobs in ways that sometimes are hard to see. So we see things like people creating new businesses, people demanding new kinds of items and innovation, things which weren't there before, which now become available. Econ 101 tells us that when countries can trade those things that they're really good at making, that it increases wealth overall. It's what economists refer to as comparative advantage. So comparative advantage says we should make those things that it's cheap for us to make, and we should buy from other people the things that it's expensive for us to make. So we see that in the US we're really good at making service products. We're very good at making automobiles. We're good at making medicines and things like that. But it's relatively expensive for us to produce things like clothing and other textiles.
Some people do lose from trade. People lose jobs.
Some people are knocked out of the jobs that they're currently in. And certainly we can talk about and be concerned about those people who are losing their jobs as a result of trade, talk about different ways that we might make those transitions easier. But trade overall is a remarkably positive game for all parties involved.
And the UN says 1 billion people are no longer miserably poor, largely because of this trade that Trump condemns.
Trade has lifted millions of people out of poverty, particularly over the last 30 years. We now see the lowest number of people living in absolute poverty that's under $2 a day. It's the lowest it's ever been in recorded human history, and that is directly related to trade.
To many people, socialism is just good, more fair, more equal than our ruthless system. The word socialist, after all, is derived from society. It suggests we're all in this together. Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist, and he almost won the Democratic nomination by promising socialist benefits.
This campaign is about moving the United States toward universal health care.
At this pro-Sanders event, his supporters carry red flags. Red, because that's the color of socialism and communism. Don't these people know history? The Soviet Union murdered millions of people. And look at what it's done to people. Look what socialism has done to people in Venezuela. 50 years ago, Venezuelans had the highest wages in South America. Then they elected Hugo Chavez. He said, we'll make it even better with socialism. American leftists were excited. A hack at Salon wrote about Hugo Chavez's economic miracle. But what really happened?
These days, thousands of people wait in long lines to try to buy food. This line goes around the block and then back again. Some lines seem to stretch for miles. Often people wait in line and then find the store has run out of food.
No hay alimentos, no hay nada.
Food's so scarce that people fight in the street over bags of flour. Ever see this in greedy capitalist free market countries? No. How do things get this bad in what was once the richest country in South America?
How do they get that bad? Well, let's ask some people who should know. Gloria Alvarez lives in Guatemala and has watched socialist ideas wreck parts of her continent. Fergus Hodson ran a newspaper that reports on Latin America. So how did this happen, Fergus?
There was a great deal of envy. There was a great deal of jealousy. Yeah, there was people were.
They didn't like it that some people were rich.
Of course, because what happened is that with the development of the oil industry in particular, foreign investors came in early on, and many people got rich to that. Many of them got wealthier. Others did not, and there was a perception that obviously there was a mercantilist economy as well. So some people were getting rich even back then in an unjust way. So if you come in and say, I'm going to solve your problems, I'm going to overcome this, that's an appealing line.
And Gloria, is it unfair? I call this death by socialism?
No, actually it's not unfair. And one of the things that we need to understand is that Venezuela is the most vivid example of something that is going on regionally, that is really well planned. When we thought that communism was history after the Berlin Wall fell, in Latin America, socialism had a new opportunity to win elections democratically, not with Marxist guerrillas, not as Cuba did, but to have the same agenda implemented. And so what they have done...
Yeah, Chavez was elected.
Yes, he was elected, Evo Morales was elected, Daniel Ortega, everyone that is now part of the socialism of the 21st century agenda was democratically elected, not through violence, but through cultural manipulation of the language, of the media, of the arts. We are going to implement the ideas that socialism is good, where people think that they want this kind of society.
Because
it's good, it's going to be better for everyone, and the leader, this is the other idea, the leader is synonym of the will of the people. The leader knows better than any individual how is everyone supposed to lead their lives.
And North Americans don't understand the problems that socialism causes either, as the Bernie Sanders' campaign showed. Dude, this cartoon depicts a socialist-loving Bernie supporter trying to convince a man from Venezuela to feel the burn. The Venezuelan says, been there, done that. He's already been burned, and he's hungry.
In Latin America, the government gives privileges to certain sectors, making the economy something only for the few. This creates resentment of the larger amounts of people, and this is when they go to some extreme. It's the same that happened in Germany after the crisis of the World War I. When Hitler said, this is the fault of the Jews, people say, okay, then we're going to elect you to change the situation. They blame free market as if we in Latin America have ever had free market, which is not the case.
The capacity of the socialists to defend their position in the face of overwhelming evidence is actually impressive. So, for example, they'll say we have shortages, that's because capitalists are hoarding. Well, if you put a price cap and say you have to sell everything way below cost, you're going to hoard things. You're not going to sell them, so
and
you
the
can't
supermarkets won't carry it. The food goes.
Of course not, yeah.
It's not just that Venezuela's out of food and opportunity. People die there because there are no medicines.
This girl's suffering because she doesn't have access to medicines she needs. Her hospital is even out of basic medical supplies like alcohol. As a result, it's mostly empty. People don't even bother going to the hospital.
So, Gloria, you have friends who are smuggling in medicine?
Yes, because it's something that is forbidden. And the funny thing is, when they go to the airport, some colonels, some sergeants that are in charge of taking these medicines away from their hands, they are asking for some of the medicines for their moms, for their grandmothers, because they also, the military is also in need for medicine for their elders. So you just increment corruption.
In America, celebrities are some of the more clueless people.
Kim Kardashian and Kanye West recently visited Cuba. They did their celebrity poverty tour. Kim wrote, "I love Cuba, one of our best trips." Here's her sister Chloe posing in front of text that reads, "Fidel." Here's movie star Sean Penn hugging Venezuela's current dictator. Oliver Stone claims the old dictator did great things for Venezuela. Stone made a movie about him, how he grew up in poverty.
This affected his view of Venezuela, as well as ultimately his lifelong mission to transform the country.
Chavez is the people.
Mm-hmm.
People buy this.
We should point out that the information people are receiving is not accurate, right? I mean, this is where I wanted to mention the fact that there's no free speech in Venezuela, that there are over 105 political prisoners right now, that the opposition newspapers are closing down because they can't get newsprint. They can't import the raw materials to get the information out.
They also get attacked by soldiers and representatives of the government.
We know personally people who are exiles, people who are former journalists in Venezuela, and people I've worked with closely. They had to use pen names to conceal their identity in the nation.
Gloria sent us this video made by people in Venezuela. Aren't the people who took these pictures at risk for taking the pictures?
Yes, absolutely. It is punished with jail if you try to film, for example, as I did, if they would have caught me because there are military personnel outside.
So all these pictures you're taking secretly?
Yes, you have to. Otherwise, you can end up in jail.
Back to the food shortages. Although socialism caused the problem, Venezuela's president blames speculators and capitalism.
La inflación inducida, especulativa, de la burbuja económica creada por la guerra económica, de un capitalismo parasitario.
Parasitic capitalism is the problem.
This is one of the most incoherent things about the regimes of the socialism of the 21st century. They tell people, listen, you're too weak, you're too dumb, I will take you out of poverty. But at the same time that they present themselves as the Messiah that will take you out of poverty, they tell you that being rich is being immoral, that being capitalistic is being immoral. How can you say that if someone starts producing, then you will punish them for being successful? But this is the essence.
Here's a sample of what some protesters said outside a gathering of Republicans during the presidential campaign.
I support Hugo Chavez and I support Castro.
I am a communist. I'd rather be a communist than for communist. Capitalism sucks.
Capitalism sucks. She's a communist. The man says he supports Chavez and Castro. How dumb can they be? Well, pretty dumb. At a Bernie Sanders rally, notice the Soviet flag Don't progressives know that the Soviet Union failed because it was awful for people? As societies become prosperous, thanks to capitalism, the people enjoying that prosperity often don't realize that their lives are pretty good only because of free markets. The richest country in Latin America now is Chile. But 50 years ago, Chile was poor.
There was a perception then by people that was convinced that the way out for a society was communism. They actually wanted to destroy the market.
He's a former minister of finance in Chile. The communists did destroy the market and ran the economy into the ground. That led to violence, much like what we see in Venezuela now.
A dictator, Augusto Pinochet, took over the government. He was vicious. He killed and jailed thousands of people. But he had the sense to leave the economy to people who understood it better than he did. He turned to economists who studied under Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago.
People that believed in free markets and a free society. That kind of things were a novelty at the beginning of the 70s in Latin America and in Chile.
Milton Friedman said, "I never advised Pinochet and none of us approved of his dictatorship." But because Pinochet allowed Friedman's suggestions, Chile boomed. Venezuela was once 4 times as rich as Chile. Now Chile's twice as rich as Venezuela. That's progress for Chile anyway. The website humanprogress.org tracks progress around the world. The editor is Marian Tupy. And most of the world has experienced progress.
Indeed, especially the age of globalization. Over the last 40 years, we have seen a dramatic decline in poverty, absolute poverty across the world. When President Reagan became President of the United States in 1981, 80% of people in East Asia lived in absolute poverty, which is to say on less than $2 a day. Today, 4% do.
Because of this globalization that Donald Trump doesn't like.
Because they trade with the rest of the world, they exchange information, and they become wealthy as a result.
So Donald Trump says we need walls, we need limits on trade.
Free trade benefits everyone, even countries which are very good at producing everything.
I like Marian's newest website. It's titled Your Life in Numbers. You can plug in any country and compare progress, or lack of it. Here you can see the massive difference in Chile and Venezuela over 40 years. In Venezuela, income fell by 21%. In Chile, it rose 228%. You also compare level of democracy. I don't know how you compare that.
Do people have a choice between 2 political parties or more political parties, between 2 or more candidates? Are there checks on the power of the executive? Do people have civil rights? Are they able to enjoy free press? Are they able to enjoy free association? And based on those criteria, countries are assigned a level of democracy.
With less state control, everything gets better. Life expectancy is longer in Chile. There's less crime.
Before Pinochet took over, Venezuelans lived longer than Chileans. Now Chileans live 8 years longer than Venezuelans.
This is what drives me crazy about people in America and Chile. They don't get it, despite how clear it is that the free market's done wonders for them. Some people in Chile, like Bernie Sanders and Green Party supporters here, still want socialist controls.
Here's a protest held in one of the richest parts of Chile. These young people demand a higher minimum wage, fuel subsidies, cheaper water, cheaper electricity. After some of them threw rocks, police turned on water cannons. The violence continued for months.
They don't understand what makes their lives better.
The advocates of small government have dropped the ball. They assumed that the great accomplishments of the Chilean economy would speak for themselves. And as a result, there are very few think tanks, civil society, political parties that defend...
Why do we have to explain it to people? It's just visible.
Because the left never bought into the Chilean economic model. The left,
or the American model,
or the American
Bernie
model.
Sanders.
They're very good at organizing, they are very militant, they make a lot of noise, they have friends in the media and amongst the young people at universities. It is very fascinating that the collapse of Venezuela has not had more of an impact on the left and really destroying the mythology around socialist economics.
Doesn't seem to have any impact on Bernie Sanders supporters.
People should have learned from the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and they haven't.
The tech revolution means everything's changing and faster than ever. Not everyone is ready for so much change.
Look, Mom, no hands.
Are you ready for the driverless car? I got to try one.
This is exciting and scary.
Scary because it's not natural to just sit here and let the car drive. This car is the Tesla S, the closest thing to a totally driverless car that consumers can buy now. I had to leave my state to test it. New York's archaic laws forbid taking both hands off the wheel. But once we were out of New York, the Tesla rep had me turn on the autopilot.
All right, so I'm doing nothing. The car is driving itself. And this truck is coming. I'm scared.
It takes time to get comfortable with having the car make decisions. In this tunnel, I was especially nervous.
This is terrifying. I'm breathing heavily here.
It turned out I was right to be scared.
Now, what happened there?
The car drifted left. My left wheel hit the side of the tunnel.
When you pulled the wheel, you disengaged the autopilot. Sorry, I wasn't looking.
You gotta tell me that.
Touching the brake or wheel takes the car out of autopilot. But once I learned how the car works, I found not driving is pretty cool, though weird.
This is not natural, but it does work. It drives itself, and it's safer than me.
Safety is the big reason we should welcome these cars. 94% of people killed in car crashes are killed because of human error. The computer in this car would prevent many of those deaths. Here, the sensors see that I'm coming up on another car.
I won't run into this car. It'll slow me down. Yeah, it already has.
If I want to change lanes, just signal.
It'll change lanes without me. Yes, it just does. And it stays in the lane.
Then we sped up to 65 miles per hour and the road turned sharply.
That was scary. I didn't think it would turn, but it does.
This car's only partly driverless. It can't go on and off highways, for example. But soon it will do everything.
People are going to be reading the paper.
Actually, not a good idea, John. I'd appreciate it if you take it off.
He stopped me because state laws say the driver must always be in control.
What if I go to sleep?
You'd be breaking the law. You need to remain in control of the vehicle at all times.
But soon, if regulators allow it, technology will let us relax in our cars. And that could change our lives. It'll save lives and create more relaxing commutes.
Now I'm in stop-and-go traffic, and the car will go without my... Yes, it will.
Also, there will be fewer traffic jams, because robots react quickly to danger. Cars will be able to drive closer together, so more cars will fit on the same road. It'll be great, says economist James Miller.
I could imagine an ad saying, computers crash. You're going to trust your life to a machine?
People know that machines are better at people at a lot of tasks.
Still, that idea of some machine, trusting it with my life.
Well, I mean, our brains are basically machines, but they're not machines that are optimized for going 65 miles an hour.
The military is making all kinds of robots. They call this one the Wildcat. These will soon deliver supplies or rescue soldiers. Some robots will be used to kill. Already robots have changed life at some Japanese hotels.
Welcome to the Hanel Hotel.
This dinosaur is a front desk clerk chosen to appeal to kids. They have all types. Another robot stores your luggage for you. This one takes it to your room, and when you get there, there's no key. The door recognizes your face through facial recognition software. This saves money. This hotel's cheaper than other hotels nearby. But it's cheaper because it employs fewer people. When robots do this work, fewer receptionists will get jobs here. Military robots will replace soldiers. Driverless cars will put taxi and truck drivers out of work. Maybe I'll lose my job to this guy.
I will take your job, John.
I'm smarter than you.
People are going to lose their jobs. They'll have nothing to do.
Well, you're right. Some people will lose their jobs, but other people will get jobs.
Whenever there's been innovation, experts predicted that employment will decline. But the experts can't imagine the new jobs.
Walmart will undoubtedly fire some truck drivers because their trucks drive themselves. But this is going to cause Walmart to lower their prices.
Those savings will bring new opportunity. Don't believe it? Well, remember that 200 years ago, most Americans worked on farms.
90% used to work on farms, now less than 2%.
Yeah.
You'd think all those people would be out of work.
A lot of people lost their jobs for a little bit of time, but then they found new jobs, and they found jobs doing things that were more productive, and that's how our economy grows.
We forget how hard it was to grow food without tractors and other modern machines. Farm work was long and dangerous.
We look back at horses and buggies. We saw the car displacing the horses, buggies, and buggy whips, but we don't lament that passage, do we? The blacksmiths of old probably had to figure out something else to do. They all found jobs. The economy evolves. It's an evolving ecosystem.
But some don't want it to evolve. These cab drivers demand that government protect their jobs.
What do we want? Regulation.
But what would the world look like if government did protect jobs?
Flushing toilets and plumbing has taken away my job.
This parody video mocks the idea.
I spent hundreds of thousands on my VHS inventory. Now what am I going to do with it?
Save the milkmen.
There are many industries needing taxpayers' support. Progress is taking our jobs.
Unfortunately, in America today, there are people who want to do what he wants to do, stop progress. Will they win? Or will our future be faster, better, cheaper? Oh, sorry, I was watching a video on YouTube. These things are a giant time suck, but they're also a good part of the tech revolution because they let people make money doing what they love.
Here is our castle cake.
3 years ago, amateur baker Rosanna Panzino decided to post videos of her adventures in baking on YouTube. I'd call this a cute hobby, except that today 5 million people subscribe to her YouTube channel, and her videos have been seen more than 1 billion times. I'm envious. I've worked all my life. I never reach nearly that many people.
You have more Twitter followers than I do.
How come you're the most popular baking show?
I have no clue, and that is a good question for everybody.
Rosanna did not plan to bake for a living. She started working odd jobs in the movie business.
I worked as a PA, I worked as a hand double, I worked as an extra.
She got a job as a dancer in the TV show Glee.
That wasn't a career?
Being a union dancer wasn't fulfilling for me. I wanted to do more.
So she posted baking videos that she shot at her parents' home.
Well, the icing's getting cold. It's going to take about a half hour, so I'm going to play some. It was just a creative outlet for me.
She told her agent about it, and he wasn't happy.
My agent really made it easy for me.
He told her,
if you don't stop making YouTube videos, we're going to drop you.
Why'd you decide YouTube?
I was getting more and more comments, and the community just kept growing.
Her YouTube fans had started asking for autographs.
It was the first time I ever went to Target, and I got recognized by a gal who worked at the store, and she said, I love the content you're creating. It makes me and my daughter so happy you inspired her to start baking. And I was trying to tell my agent that there's value here. This is amazing. This is real.
Comedian Glozell Green's another performer who caught on YouTube.
YouTube has saved my life because I was doing stand-up and it was not going well because I'm not that funny. But on the internet, in a couple of minutes, people were like, oh, she's great.
She even got to interview the president.
Thank you.
That's great.
Her silly YouTube channel now makes her $50,000 a year. This Swedish guy named PewDiePie makes $12 million just by talking while playing video games.
No, drink the coffee. You want to drink the... Yes!
He leads Forbes' list of highest earning YouTube stars. Rosanna's number 8. She makes $2 million.
The YouTube platform is such a good platform for people who are starting out, who want to create content and don't have investors.
YouTube keeps about 40% of the money.
And that's fine.
This is a new way to discover unknown talent.
Journalist Steve Knopper covers the music business.
YouTube is the great equalizer right now. It's sort of like if you have an idea and you're talented or not talented, you can put something up on YouTube.
Justin Bieber got his start posting this video when he was 12. The YouTube numbers grew, and then a record label called.
Every now and then, YouTube creates a star.
It used to be there were gatekeepers. Some fat guy with a cigar said, "You got to please me, maybe sleep with me to get the record."
Right. Those cigar chomping guys, they dominated the record business for many, many years, and they were the gatekeepers.
Because it costs tens of thousands of dollars.
Right. It costs money to market your album. It costs money to put your song on the radio. Today, you can get your album to millions of people around the world with just the click of a button.
They're not going and banging on the door of Sony Music and asking for permission.
Max Borders runs a conference that showcases new technology and new artists.
Look at Lindsey Sterling. She plays the violin. Imagine her showing up in one of the big music studios in New York and saying, "Hey, please, can I get a record deal? I'm really good at the violin."
Well, she did. She was turned down.
Well, that's right. And so all of a sudden, she becomes a YouTube sensation. Fills stadiums now. You can't argue with that. That is when the crowd decides.
I think that people are very smart. I think they're very intuitive, and they pick up on when you love what you're doing, they can see it.
This direct connection to the audience threatened the music industry.
The record industry's traditional model has been selling pieces of plastic that contain all the music. And hundreds of millions of records were being sold, all the way up to the Britney Spears and Backstreet Boys era. And people were just making money hand over fist.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. In the late 90s, suddenly the internet kicks in.
How many MP3s do you have on your computer?
About 600.
6,000 or 7,000.
Napster and MP3s came in and allowed people to essentially share all the music in the world for free. And that was a threat to the business model.
The music industry sued.
They started by suing Napster and Nutella and Kazaa and LimeWire.
So they freaked out and sued these people and sued their own customers sometimes.
And they sued a 13-year-old girl and her family, and it turned out to be some pretty bad publicity for the record industry in the end.
Hence Knopper's book title, Appetite for Self-Destruction. Now the record labels license their music to streaming services like Apple, Spotify, and Pandora. These changes now happen so fast.
Yeah, they do. The new thing is streaming,
which pays musicians just a fraction of a penny per stream. How does a musician make money?
Going on tour. Touring has always been important, but it's more important than ever now.
But doesn't that mean that fewer people can make a living this way? Because not everybody can go on tour.
It does. It's a very diminished business than what it was 10 or 15 years ago, absolutely. However, there are many more opportunities for younger bands, littler bands, to get big.
And the audience wins too.
We have all the music we could ever want for free or for a minimal price at our fingertips on our mobile devices. It's a golden age of music for consumers.
The astonishing growth in prosperity in the last 200 or 300 years is one of the greatest events of humankind. Take the average human in, say, the year 1000 BC. He's poor, fighting to find food and to fend off diseases. Fast forward 500 years to the time of classical Greece. Still poor, still hungry. How about another 1,000 years after that? It's the Dark Ages. Wow, still poor. Then jump to the 18th century and forward. Things change rapidly. This phenomenon is known as the hockey stick of human prosperity. Take what is surely one of the most important measures of human well-being, life expectancy. Before the Industrial Revolution, life expectancy was around 30 years. Today, in the United States, we expect to live to be about 80. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, 1 in 4 kids would die before the age of 5. Today, in developed countries, it's more like 1 in 200. Due to better nutrition, we grow to be 4 inches taller than we were just 150 years ago. Remember this disease? No, you don't, because it was eradicated in 1977. Look around. You'll find a roof over your head and a hard floor under your feet. Most of our ancestors lived in huts with dirt floors and thatched roofs. Everything was infested with insects and rodents. Streets and alleys were open sewers. There were none of these. The filth was horrible and often toxic. Our ancestors ate gruel and wore the same homemade underwear over and over. Now, even the least fortunate Americans typically have electricity, running water, toilets, refrigerators, televisions, and yes, cheap, washable underwear. Those of us who live in modern industrial society are incredibly, amazingly off the charts rich compared to our ancestors. And here's yet another huge difference between us and our ancestors. Before the Industrial Revolution, people knew how to make from scratch many of the things they consumed. They made a lot of their own clothing, grew most of their own food, and built their own dwellings. Fast forward to today, and believe it or not, none of us has a hint of how to make the majority of the things that we consume. Just getting ready in the morning involves taking many trips around the globe. Take this coffee, for example. The beans come from Guatemala, and they were brewed in this coffee maker from Switzerland. The container ship that carried the beans was built in Korea. It's insured by a company from London, and it's captained by a Frenchman who loves Turkish cigarettes. We've transitioned from each of us doing many things to each of us doing one thing. Having a job only makes sense in a modern world, where each individual typically does only one type of work. So while we mostly only produce one thing, doing one job, each of us now consumes a whole bunch of products that require a whole bunch of jobs to produce. The question of where prosperity comes from launched the field of economics. It's why Adam Smith wrote the first book in modern economics, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Back in 1776, when he published it, Smith was trying to understand the causes of modern prosperity that were just starting to appear. Poverty and starvation was still normal, as they had been from the beginning, but in the late 18th century, for the first time ever, the masses began to enjoy riches once reserved only for the nobility. It is this mass prosperity that Adam Smith sought to explain. Why was it happening? What was causing wealth to move from being the exception to being the norm? Now we look around and try to figure out what causes poverty instead of what causes prosperity.
A lot of gloom and doom types say that we're living in dark times. I disagree. Take a breath. It's a great time to be alive. Sure, there are problems, but people have never been as healthy, as wealthy, or as happy as they are today. Just in the past few decades, more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of dire poverty. So what's causing all this awesomeness? Look, for centuries, the dominant policy idea was mercantilism. It was a terrible idea. Its main tenet was to accumulate within your national borders as much money as possible. That's right, to accumulate money like a miser. Yet that was the best policy idea we had. And then suddenly, ideas started sparking all across Europe. One of those ideas created modern economics. And economics, in turn, fuels other changes. One of the best was the elimination of the corn laws in Great Britain. It took a reform movement in the mid-19th century to end those tariffs, which were starving many of the masses by unnecessarily raising the cost of their daily bread. Fortunately, tariffs continued to fall in the 20th century, allowing world trade to boom and living standards to keep rising. We learned economics in smaller ways as well. For example, we tried wage and price controls, but as economists predicted, they utterly failed. So we stopped that, mostly. Auctioning off the airwaves seemed like a crazy idea when it was first proposed, until it was tried. It put billions of dollars in the US Treasury, and now governments from around the world copy it. The explosion of the internet would not have happened were it not for a policy framework developed in the 1990s that allowed for permissionless innovation. Look, the world has never been better than it is today. Yet we know that it can be better still. So, what are the policy changes today that will lead to an even better tomorrow? Have we got some ideas for you?
Let's say you design a policy that takes 1 penny from 1 million people. And it gives that $10,000 to one person. Who's going to know about this policy? Are any of the million going to even notice? I bet you the guy who gets 10,000 will. I'm Ben Powell, a professor of economics at Suffolk University. Here we have politicians promising to cut spending, which voters generally want. But that's a dispersed benefit. When they actually pick the specific programs, that's a concentrated cost. Let's do some real back-of-the-envelope calculations here. There's roughly 300 million people in the United States. Roughly half of them are registered to vote. That's 150 million.
If half of them show up in any given national election, that's about 75 million. For your vote to change the outcome of an election, it would have to be exactly 37,500,000 to 37,500,000, and you showing up at the polls makes it 37,500,001 to tip the outcome so that you actually get a different result. What's the likelihood of that happening? Near zero. In fact, economists have figured out you're more likely to die in a car accident on the way to the polling place than to change the outcome of a major national election. As a result, voters are massively ignorant of the policies and their politicians, and it makes sense. But a lot of interest groups are very well informed about policies, not all of their politicians' policies, but those policies that specifically affect them. Farmers who get farm subsidies have a big incentive to know which politicians support their subsidies and how much they're getting. As a result, they not only know about it, but give money to the campaigns to help these people get elected and make sure they stay in favor of the favored subsidies. Meanwhile, spread across the food cost of an average American, it's a trivial amount of money, so most Americans don't even know or feel this cost. And if they do, they hear some general ad on television that talks about how farmers are good for America, and they feel good about this inefficient policy. These same interest groups that lobby to get their benefits, lobby to keep their benefits. This is the logic of politics, and this is why we end up with more spending than the average voter usually wants.
Elijah was born in Canada in 1843 to two fugitive slaves. They had escaped from Kentucky with help from the Underground Railroad. They eventually returned to the United States and settled in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Elijah's parents were poor, but they managed to save enough money to send him to Scotland at 15 so he could study mechanical engineering. It paid off. When Elijah came back to the United States, he went to work for the Michigan Central Railroad. Trains at the time were no good. They overheated constantly and needed to be completely stopped and cooled down just to replace the oil. These stops cost the railroads countless hours of lost time. But that all changed in 1872 when Elijah patented a brilliant new device that automatically oiled locomotive parts while the trains kept moving. It was a massive breakthrough, and his invention was so good that other engineers quickly started copying his work. Nothing came close. No matter what his competitors came up with, Elijah's engineering skills were unmatched, and Elijah didn't stop inventing. By the time he died in 1929, at the age of 86, Elijah, the son of former slaves, born 20 years before the Civil War, had earned 57 patents and founded his own successful manufacturing company. His very name became famous for superior quality. As the railroad workers used to say, anything less just wasn't the real McCoy. More stories about men and women like Elijah McCoy can be found in Lawrence W. Reed's new book, Real Heroes.